We're now going to have a look at the question of professionalism and the ethical issues that relate to professionalism. In this module, what I hope to do is go through what a profession is, why it relates to ethics, and what in particular a property professional must consider if they're going to be taking on the title of professional rather than simply a skilled occupation.
From these, what we'll be finding is that the question of ethics is central to the notion of a professional. However, the question of ethics is not a settled matter, because especially in our highly pluralistic society, the question of ethics is now quite vague, and unfortunately we live at a time where the moral philosophy behind ethics is particularly unsettled. It's now common to refer to property practitioners as property professionals, but the question we must begin with is, what does it take to be a professional, and are the property careers actually professionals? When we look around, we see that the traditional professionals, say medicine and law, are somehow different to other careers, such as being a mechanic or a plumber. What is it that distinguishes a professional from some other trade or career or vocation? We can look at the question of what careers now have the title professional attached to them, because we find that we have professional boxers, professional football players, even professional firemen. I was once told, while working as a labourer during one of my university breaks, that being a labourer was in fact a profession, and I should deal with my shovel with pride. I didn't tell my employer at the time that I was only on break from university and I was studying to be a professional. And while I think there is a certain amount of self-respect that goes with the title of professional, somehow the idea of being a professional labourer didn't seem to cut it. What then is the distinction? We can look at the difference between amateur sportsmen and professional sportsmen, and we find that an amateur boxer is one who does not get paid for their work or their activity, whereas a professional boxer is somebody who receives some kind of payment. But somehow the idea of merely being paid doesn't seem to completely explain what it is to be a professional. Otherwise, we would find that every activity, such as being a taxi driver, or maybe serving in a shop, or filling up cars at a petrol station, would all be professions. And if every career, every paid employment was professional, then the whole idea of being a professional would in fact be an almost meaningless concept. In other words, it would be merely synonymous to being paid for what you do. I guess we could even consider being a professional thief or bank robber in amongst the ranks of what it is to be a professional, if it merely means someone who gets paid for their work. Clearly, being a professional means something different to merely being paid for a particular job or activity. And while we may have respect for mechanics, plumbers and football players, there is something distinct about being a genuine professional that these particular vocations do not realise. One of the things that we can identify with the traditional professions, such as law and medicine, is that professionals execute important activities that cannot be understood by the community. Now, this is important to take apart. We're talking about important activities, not merely some trivial item. Doctors deal with health, and that is the very life of their clients. Lawyers tend to work with their freedom in the execution of justice. Again, very important concepts. But the second aspect is just as important. While we may be dealing with significant issues in a person's life, the curious thing about a professional is that they deal with them in a way that their client, and in fact the community, cannot fully understand. In fact, when we look closely, we find that the major distinction between the doings of a medical practitioner and what a mechanic does, while they have certain similarities, one makes sure that the mechanisms of the body are kept in good working order, while the other one makes sure that the mechanisms of an automobile are kept in similar good working order. The difference is that it is relatively easy for the average person to assess whether the work of a mechanic is in fact being done well. And what this means is that by and large the community is able to assess the quality of the mechanic, the plumber, and especially the fireman. However, the community generally isn't able to assess the quality of the medical practitioner. The average person doesn't understand drugs and surgery and the other arts that the medical practitioner brings to the exercise of health for his clients. To a certain extent, the community and the client have to trust the medical practitioner. Likewise, the complexities of the law mean that while we may have a vague idea of bush justice, the actual execution of that in particular cases is something that requires a specialist to be able to do, and to be able to do well means that they have to understand things that the average person cannot. And we can extend that to other professions such as engineering. However, generally this is not the case for plumbers, mechanics and rugby players. What this means though is that the clients of the professional have to rely on their professionals with an act of trust. When you go in to have some operation in a hospital, you have to trust that the people in there, the whole team, are going to make sure to the best of their efforts that you come out alive, and preferably better off than when you went in. And this element of trust is very, very important. Trust overall means that a person has to make a decision, usually to do with some important part of their life, based not on anything that they have control over, but on the actions of another person, and to a certain extent on the free actions of another person. This means that the client and the community must be confident that the professional is going to put them in front of themselves. That is, the professional must put the client before the professional, or the professional's self-interest. This means that if the professional, because of his particular position of executing important activities that are not fully understood by the community, is certainly able to abuse the client and the community in a variety of ways. And so that while you are under the anaesthetic, the doctor might do some very unexpected things to your body that you may not particularly appreciate when you come out of the anaesthetic. The professional must be motivated by the good of their client, even though they're going to get paid and preferably get rewarded adequately for the skill and responsibility they take on. Income cannot be the only motivator for the professional, because if it was, the professional bank robber would probably be the top of the professional tree. As a result of this, professions used to be distinguished by the fact that they all took oaths before the community to say that they would practice their profession in a way which deserves the trust of their clients and the community. Of these, the best known professional oath these days is the Hippocratic oath, that goes back about 2,500 years to the ancient Greeks. This oath has been taken by medical practitioners almost continuously since Hippocrates right down to recent history. A close reading of the Hippocratic Oath is worthwhile because we often hear about it being mentioned in this context or that, and you will find that it includes most critical areas of professional practice. It includes the importance of specialist skill and the commitment of the professional to serve his profession as a group by passing on the knowledge that he might have in order to benefit the profession and in that way benefit the community. The second element in the Hippocratic Oath is the commitment to the client. I will use those dietary regimes which will benefit my patients according to my greatest ability and judgment. That means that the professional will use their greatest ability and judgment, not merely a easy application of their skill, but they will aim to make every activity they do for their client the best they are able to. And in the case of medical practitioners, Hippocrates followed that up with a very simple statement: I will do no harm or injustice to them. For a medical practitioner, this includes the choice of drugs, such as the administration of poison and so on. Likewise, there are elements in the Hippocratic Oath, perhaps particular to the position of a medical practitioner, in terms of not abusing clients in the various ways, and also to maintain a certain level of discretion, because often in the exercise of their arts, practitioners are privy to confidential information of various sorts. And we find that medical practitioners undertake that whatever they see or hear in the lives of their patients, in connection with their professional practice or not, they will keep secret and consider all such things to be private. Likewise, we see that very much evident in the case of legal practitioners, and it also has applications for property practice. Overall, we can interpret the Hippocratic Oath as an example of the commitment taken by a professional at the beginning of their careers to serve the community and their clients through their profession, to administer their art as well as they are able, and in critical junctures not to put their self-interest before that of the client and the community. Ultimately, oaths are ethical undertakings. That is, they are an undertaking to act in a particular way by free choice. And this is really the definition of an ethic. What this means is that the distinguishing characteristic of a professional is not their skill or their income or their status in the community, but their decision to make an ethical undertaking, to take a moral responsibility for their work in a way that other activities and arts, such as the mechanic and the plumber, don't need to take. While mechanics and plumbers may have some ethical obligations to the communities, by and large their crafts do not demand an ethical relationship with the community as an absolute necessity, largely because of the transparency of the quality of their art to the community in general. While young property economists are not required to take an oath before they are released on the general public as property economists, one way or another they do something similar. And this is because, like other professions, property economics has a code of ethics, which is essentially the same effect as a formal oath. It's an undertaking by members of the profession to act in a certain ethical way. In order to understand that, we first have to clarify a couple of terms. We understand generally the notion of an ethic. It's An ethical person is somebody who does the right thing and in some way has some form of integrity. But this is a very general and loose definition. If we look more formally, we find that the definition of a moral is that it is a principle for appropriate relations between persons. This does not mean that a moral is a rule or an imposition, but it is simply a principle. This is important because the personal adoption of a principle is something that is always done with freedom. And this is critical because one way or another, a slave or someone under compulsion cannot act morally even if they do a good thing. The good thing they do is no less good. But there is no morality attached to a forced act. If I am forced to do some good thing, walk a little old lady across the road or something, if I'm forced, maybe under pain of death or something, it's hardly my merit that causes me to do that action. It's rather the fear of some punishment. Likewise, if I'm similarly forced to do some evil thing, again, at law, I'm not held accountable, and this is because my moral culpability is dependent on my freedom. And so the notion of a moral as a principle only is very, very important, because the notion of freedom is all the way through the understanding of ethics and moral responsibility. This allows us to move on to the question of an ethic. While we often use ethics in the plural, an ethic fundamentally is no more than a set of morals. And so, strictly speaking, the property profession follows a professional ethic, and the legal profession also has their own professional ethic, just as the doctors do. And so when we talk about professions in plural, we talk about their codes of ethics in plural, but each profession has a single ethic. What does a code of ethics imply? It implies a free undertaking, therefore, for the professional, the person who has professed this obligation to the community, a free obligation taken by them to act in a way which the community and the client can trust. Now, while Hippocratic was willing to bring down the wrath of the gods if he violated his oath, the sanctions that are in force tend by and large to be social or perhaps to do with a professional institution, and only seldom are they actually enshrined in secular, in other words, state law. In Australia, the various states have various legislation regulating the activities of practitioners involved in property valuation and other areas of property economics, such as land surveying and various specialised areas of finance. However, there is much more in the activity of the property economist than simply that which is prescribed by state law. To a certain extent, the Australian Property Institute represents the professional body, the association, the collection, the club of professionals who undertake to call themselves property professionals and approach the community deserving their trust. And so to be a part of the Australian Property Institute or the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors or one of the other professional institutions related to the property professions means to undertake to follow their code of practice, which is again a set of principles that is freely accepted by members. Here the sanction is that if a property practitioner violates the code of ethic or the ethical code of the API, it's likely that that practitioner will have their membership terminated. They will be basically cast out. They might still parade themselves as a property economist, but they are no longer a part of that body of professional property economists which are collected under the banner of the API or the RICS or one of the other professional institutions. The community, to a certain extent, recognises this, and you'll find that large organisations tend to insist on having their work done by people who are recognised by professional associations. And so for much valuation work, larger organisations, especially banks, insist that it's carried out by a member of the API, at least. To a certain extent, the sanctions on the professions are not absolutely watertight, but then again, there are really no watertight ways of ensuring that other people in the community don't violate our rights or our interests in some extent. Otherwise we would have no bank robbers and so on. And from time to time, both the state, through its legislation, and the professional associations review their ways of applying sanctions to professional practice. And this is why from time to time the Valuation Act will change, and also the ethical code of the API will be revised along with its other directives for professional practice. However, the external pressures will never be sufficient to ensure that an individual does exercise their art as a property economist in the way that the community may expect. This is because the ideal source of compliance is not external sanction, but rather the free decision and commitment of the individual property economist, in this case, to actually act according to the ethical demands, the demands of justice ultimately, for the interests of their client and the community. And so for this reason, while we may have state legislation and a code of ethics by the institution, ultimately it's up to the individual to uphold those codes in their own life out of a free decision, a free choice. We find that when we look across different cultures, we find that there are different attitudes and different levels of willingness perhaps to undertaking this kind of commitment. By and large, Indigenous people have an elevated sense of obligation to their community, and as a result, for an Indigenous person, usually it would be unthinkable for them to in some way violate the trust of their fellow tribesmen or clansmen. And so for this reason, to a certain extent, for Indigenous people and societies that have these kinds of high levels of social cohesion, the explicit need for a professional code of ethics is considerably less important, to the extent that while they still might be undertaken, it would be considered as less of an external binder. In societies which are less cohesive, such as our own, where the level of trust one way or another is significantly less than in a small clan-based community, we do need the external supports of things like the codes of ethics of professional institutions and the formal legal sanction by state statute. We'll move now to look a little bit more closely at the API Code of Professional Conduct. This is the ethical code for the API, if you like, and it is currently the document that practitioners undertake to accept in their professional practice. Near the start of the Code of Professional Conduct, we'll find that the API anticipates that members must carry out their professional duties ethically, with honesty, competency, and in good faith, without personal bias, and in a manner which upholds the values and reputations of the property and valuation profession. Now, these are fine words, and most people would be quite proud to stand behind them. And from that introduction, the Code of Professional Conduct moves on to look at a number of particular issues, in other words, particular places where the property economist must realise ethics, good faith, and acting with honesty and without personal bias in their day-to-day professional activities. However, the fundamental question is, what power does this section 1.1 have? Because many of the terms used in this introductory section are in fact relatively equivocal in today's culture. For instance, we could say, what does ethics mean? What does it mean to carry out your professional duties ethically? Is it your ethic or my ethic? And is there some constant standard by which we can test whether a property practitioner is in fact acting ethically? Likewise, the question of good faith is now something which has been often reduced to a level of almost subjectivity, especially in a world where many people unfortunately have been led astray into thinking that truth has no actual objective content. What this means is that good faith for me might mean a different thing to good faith for you. And so if I wanted to in some way do you an injustice because of the power I have as a result of my professional position with respect to you, you may not understand what I mean by good faith if my truth is different to your truth. Lastly, the notion of professional bias is important. This is particularly the case where professional opinion is required, such as in the valuation activities. Without personal bias is usually overlaid not simply by the fact that I might be having a coloured interpretation of the world because of my experiences, but rather because of some level of self-interest. It may be in my interests, for instance, to overstate or understate a property value. And so my bias for my personal benefit might come through in my work, and that may in some way be translated to some form of profit or benefit that I might derive from the relationship with my client. And so again, the API is saying we will not be doing this, and then after you read the rest of the code, you'll find many ways that acting without professional bias is actually realised. Overall, this suggests that we need some standard for understanding what these critical ethical or moral terms mean. And so this leads us back ultimately to the question of how ethics work and whether there is some knowable standard that we can refer to as ethics. The importance of getting this question of ethics right comes through in its implications, one of which is noted in section 3.2 of the Code of Professional Conduct, where the API demands that members shall conduct themselves in a manner and demeanour which is neither detrimental to their profession nor likely to lessen the confidence of clients or the public in the institute or the profession. And what this is saying is that if we get the wrong ethic and we operate in a way which is unethical, even though we might be comfortable with the behaviour or the practice ourselves, and so it might suit our ethic and simply not theirs, it will risk lessening the confidence of clients or the public in the institute or the profession. And this is one of the ironies of the whole question of ethics, that one way or another, the question of society and the community, the cohesion of that collection of people that make up the community, is ultimately grounded on the strength of their confidence in the unity of ethical understanding across the community. Because once that confidence in the ethics of another is in some way shaken, and that can be shaken merely by not being sure of which code of morals or ethics the other person in a relationship is following, one way or another it lessens our confidence in the other. And so if I find myself in a foreign country where I'm not sure whether taxi drivers are the sort of people that steal from you or not, my confidence in hopping into a taxi is going to be somewhat different to, say, if I hop into one in Australia, where I know that there are standards and norms of conduct which taxi drivers all follow. And while we can apply this from taxi drivers to property professionals, we can see that it operates right across the community. And so the confidence that we have in those around us is largely and ultimately bound up with our confidence in their adoption of an ethic that is consistent to our expectations. And this means that ethics, one way or another, have to be transpersonal or superpersonal. In other words, they have to be bigger than the individual. Another way of describing the matter of confidence in the Institute of the Profession is to say that it is the matter of trust. And so we come back to this element of trust that we noted became apparent early in our investigation of the meaning of professionalism. The practicalities of trust come through in Section 2 of the Code of Professional Conduct, where the API focuses on the question of conflict of interest. Now, while we all understand the generalization of what a conflict of interest means, at a level, a conflict of interest means a situation where the self-interest of the professional is different to the interests, the objectives that will bring about the good in the client. Now, one way or another, there is always a conflict of interest for the professional. The professional, if they were a rational, self-interested individual, as Adam Smith suggested that all economic actors are, the professional would prefer to earn the highest professional fees for the smallest amount of professional effort. And this means that every time the professional acts in a way that the client doesn't understand to perform some important service for the client, because the client can't fully understand what goes on in the back room, so to speak, of the professional's office, professionals always have the opportunity, one way or another, to shortchange their clients. This is a fairly global question of self-interest, or rather, of conflict of interest. However, we normally look at more evident and more apparent examples of conflicts of interest. For instance, if I am a property valuer and I also happen to own shares in a development company, there will be a conflict of interest between my professional valuation of the space that that development company produces and my interest in earning a profit from it. And we find many cases where this more explicit conflict of interest becomes an issue. To a certain extent, a level of human psychology needs to be taken into account when considering these cases. I have said that all professional activity involves some level of conflict of interest. However, for most practitioners, most of the time, their resolve to follow those principles for appropriate relations are relatively strong enough to be able to avoid the temptation to fall into the trap of acting in self-interest and therefore betraying trust. However, if the temptation is very great, such as the case where I might stand to earn literally hundreds of thousands of dollars as a result of my misvaluation of the products coming from my development company's activities, that temptation psychologically might be overwhelming. And these are usually the places where we observe a particular conflict of interest. By contrast, the likelihood of conflicts of interest, say for lesser vocations such as mechanics or plumbers, tend to be considerably less. While the plumber may like to go home early and as a result maybe not use quite the same amount of diligence in fixing my taps as he may, the opportunity for self-interest in that case and conflict of interest is relatively small. And again, as we've mentioned earlier, I'll be able to tell if my tap leaks or my plumbing drips or whatever. I can tell at a glance whether the plumber has done an adequate job. And so their scope for acting out of self-interest is considerably reduced. Overall, the Code of Conduct paints a fairly fine, detailed picture of what is expected from the property professional, because the property professional is supplying a very important service to the community, and one which generally the community doesn't understand. On the other side of the picture is that while professionals have significant obligations to the community returns the favour with significantly higher incomes for professional practice than for other occupations. And this is one of the distinguishing features between professions and, let's say, other skilled activities such as our plumbers and mechanics. And so income can be seen as one of the dimensions of being a professional. We've already seen that being a professional relies on the importance of supplying some sort of important service that must be trusted by the community, or must be accepted with trust by the community. In practice, to perform some important service means that you must have specialised skill and education, and this is usually seen as coming through a university type course, although there are other ways to become professionals. The API, being the representative of the profession for the community, indicates that professionals tend to be self-regulating, and this degree of self-regulation is tied up with the notion of trust and the notion of the arcane nature of the services provided. Again, while mechanics and plumbers might have their craft associations, they don't have the import that, say, the Australian Medical Association or the Bar Association or the Australian Property Institute holds for its members. And of course this comes back down to ethics. Now I'd like to look a little bit further though at the importance of skill and education for a professional. It's possible and fairly easy to teach most of the component parts of property practice at a TAFE, at a technical level education. However, the distinguishing characteristic between a professional and a technician is that the education has to be beyond job-ready skills. While there's always an inclination for students to say, how does this apply to my work? The important thing about a professional is that they're expected to understand a lot more than merely what is needed for the next job they're likely to do, or even the jobs they're likely to do in the next 5 years. True professionals are intended to have an education that runs a lot deeper than simply their immediate job. And this extends not simply in the technical area, say in an understanding of property for property economists, but also into a wider education to understand their place in the larger community. And generally, professionals are called upon to have more educated opinions on larger issues, say to do with the operation of the economy or even in politics. Today, most professions demand at least a university degree as a benchmark for entry. This does not mean that genuine professionals and well-qualified people capable of performing all of the duties we've discussed so far can't be achieved without a university education. And if we look back in history, we find it wasn't a long time ago that accountants and property people, and in fact even engineers, if we go back far enough, did not go to university. Some of the best of them came out of TAFE. However, they added to their technical education, practical education in the field, usually in a form of apprenticeship or articles, which is a form of professional education or professional apprenticeship, but also the strength of a long period of professional experience before being fully recognised. And so while the university degree has become the norm, it's not the only way for a person to get the kind of total education and background understanding of the world and the place of their craft in it that really befits a professional. Today there is a lot of emphasis on the pace of change in the professional world. especially any profession which has some kind of connection with the law. Property economics certainly has this. And so for this reason, continuing professional education is particularly important. It's up to the individual to assess the actual value of particular continuing professional education activities. But one of the spin-offs of continuing professional education is that it helps to maintain a network operating between professionals or members of a profession. And so if you go along to a conference or some other training event or educational event, part of the learning can be just speaking to other people that are participating. And it's very important for professionals to consider very seriously becoming a very active part of the local profession in the region that they're operating. Overall, it's expected that professionals have an understanding which is not merely sufficient for their technical exercise of their work, but really an understanding at the edge of the discipline. And this means as new approaches become available or new questions are asked and answered, local professionals should be equipping themselves with this latest knowledge. This is one of the functions of continuing professional education. In former days it was assumed that professionals would take this on simply because of their enthusiasm, their passion for their craft. Now, while the notions of enthusiasm and passion are partly being drained out of our culture, it's still important that in some way this kind of enthusiasm for one's vocation, partly motivated by your relationship or your understanding of your relationship with the community. The flip side of this is that professionals undertake to contribute in some way, where appropriate, to knowledge growth in their professional area. As you go through your professional lives, it's likely that you may find yourself working on new and leading edge activities within the profession. And it then becomes important for the community of the property economics professionals that your new insights coming from your particular experiences are made available to your fellows. And this is where things like the Australian Property Journal, or as it's now known, the Australian New Zealand Property Journal, is very, very important to keep up with. Even if you're not narrowly employed in the area of valuation, it's an opportunity to see what new contributions to knowledge are coming from your fellow professionals. And also it's important for you to consider, maybe not immediately on graduation, but certainly before you retire, to have at least as one goal to perhaps publish a paper in the Australian Property Journal, or at least some other equivalent form. You find this also in other forms of professional participation, not just in publishing in professional journals, but also at presentations, at conferences, as well as participation. One exciting aspect of becoming a professional is realising that you're reaching pretty much the top of the tree when it comes to understanding in your discipline. And this means that the gap between the teachers and the learners tends to narrow. This is not to say that when you do undergraduate property, the gap is so narrow that the students can take over the role of the teachers. But rather, when you're out with 5 or 10 years experience, you could well find yourself coming back to give guest classes to new and upcoming hopeful members of the profession. If we move now to looking at professional income, we've seen that professionals earn higher incomes than other crafts and trades. However, why should this be the case? Is it that the professionals deserve a higher income, or is it that the incomes cause people to be professional? What this means is that we need some theory of merit or worth. There must be some way of being able to justify, ethically perhaps, or at least before the community, that the professional does deserve this higher income. The philosopher Foucault was of the opinion that the higher income that professionals earn was merely the result of the fact that they do have superior income, and as a result they're able to exercise power over the community, a form of extortion. Now this is a very unsavoury theory of professional income. However, on the other hand, it can be seen that because you need a higher income, it does justify in some way sufficient income to be able to support the education that a professional needs, and also the time for additional professional development. And so there is this merit to having an income, because it means that you give your professionals the resources in order to stay at the head of their game and contribute to the development of it. And so in this way, there is a kind of two-way causal relationship between professional income and professional service to the community. The old concept of leisure should be considered here. We normally think of leisure as goofing off, as being able to just have time when you're absolutely doing nothing useful. But in fact, leisure is a concept which is actually associated with learning and with development of an understanding of things greater than the immediate. And this notion of being able to study and having the leisure to study is very important, because it enables people to do things, to study things beyond what they need for their next job. And remember, this is the way we described the work of the professional and the type of education that a professional needs. Another element in the puzzle of professional income is to recognise that high income does not equal professionalism. Just because I might earn a large income, it doesn't mean that the work I do has the qualities of being a professional. If I am a professional actor or a professional singer, it doesn't require some ethical relationship with the community. It's simply because my skills are in such short supply that I can do what Foucault was complaining about, and that is use my monopoly power because of my single control of my unique skills to be able to extort a very high income from the community. And there are other cases where individuals are able, one way or another, to exact a high income from what they do, even without being dishonest. However, their activities are not necessarily professional, or at least not professional in the true sense of the word. And so what we find as we come to the end of looking at professional income is that there is this difficulty with the notion of income. On one sense, it is deserved because of the high value of the work that professionals do for the community. It's also necessary because professionals need the resources to be able to educate themselves and maintain themselves at the edge of their skill set. They also need to have sufficient income to be insulated from the temptation to skim in their professional practice. And this is something that needs to be considered fairly subtly. If professionals are governed purely by market forces, it means that they would be tempted to reduce the quality of their work to the barest minimum necessary in order to fulfill their obligations or the expectations of their clients. However, if clients are not able to judge the quality of the work, it means that professionals could skim in terms of the resources they put into their work and still take away their professional incomes. What this means is that generally, if professional incomes are competed too far down as a result of market forces, there becomes an unfair burden or temptation on the part of professionals to actually perform their work at less than a professional level, because after all, no one but another professional would be able to catch them out. Overall, our community is still grappling with this problem of whether professionals really do earn their income and to what extent they should be accountable to the market, as opposed to some other mechanism for setting professional incomes. Ultimately, this question of income comes back to what is becoming a chorus in our examination of professionalism, and that is the dimension of ethics, because one way or another, a professional has the power, as Foucault complained, to be able to extort the community if they wish. But we would rather hope that genuine professionals would be sufficiently ethical not to do this. If the question of professional income gives way to ultimately a relatively simple ethical dilemma, we find that it's also reflected in the quality of professionals who tend to be organised as a result of self-regulation. Trades and arts which do not need to approach the community as a result of trust, such as the mechanics and the plumbers we've been talking about, do not need self-regulation because the community is quite able and capable of regulating and setting the quality standards of those crafts. However, it's only another professional that is able to gauge the quality of a professional's work. And what this means is that ultimately regulation of professional quality has to be left to the professionals themselves, or at least their organisations. And this is why professional institutes are so important amongst the professions, such as the Australian Property Institute or the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. Unfortunately, relying on professional institutes still leaves us with the difficulty of who we can trust. Can the community trust professional bodies? Today, if we look around the property professions, we find that while there are professional institutes such as the API and the RICS, we also find that there are other groups that purport to represent the industry, and these can be referred to as lobby groups. They are often heavily funded by particular parts of the property industry, and their primary purpose is to produce opinions and other influential matter, either for the media or for politicians or other decision makers, that are going to further the commercial interests of the people that fund them and support them. There's not a lot of point in specifying which groups we might be referring to here, but it's up to the students to be able to identify them. And what we find is that these bodies, which often purport to approach the community representing the professional community, are in fact pushing a particular view for the development of the interests of that sector of the industry that is supported by that view. This produces what we could call a cheap professionalism, and unfortunately the balance between lobby groups versus genuine professional institutions has a large bearing on how the public ultimately perceives a particular body. We've seen how professional ethics keep coming up over and over again, even though we might be discussing different attributes or dimensions of professionalism that at first do not appear to have an ethical foundation. What we need, therefore, is to be able to understand better than other crafts and trades in the community what is the stuff of ethics. We'll begin by simply looking at the quality of ethics as a priority for the other. One way or another, it's related to trust, or the confidence of the community, and it's the confidence that the other is not suiting themselves. If I meet you in some relationship, it's up to you to be confident that I'm not going to be working to suit my selfish desires, which means that I'll be putting you second when I make some decision that you're not aware of or perhaps don't have the power to. If I'm a professional serving you as my client, you have to be able to trust that you can rely on me to suit your interests and the interests of the community, even when it may put constraints upon me and my self-interests. And this is the very core of ethics. What we need to do is require an exploration of the meaning of ethics, because our culture generally avoids discussion on ethics, and it tends to find it easier to leave it to the individual, leaving everybody to be able to assert quite comfortably that they have their own ethics and they are ethical people. However, if ethics has to do with the confidence that the other is not suiting themselves, then the idea of having an ethic as something that the individual decides for themselves privately, then that is the one thing that we can conclude definitely cannot be ethical.
So hopefully now we can come to a final summary of what we've seen with professional ethics and the importance of it for professionalism. What we've seen is that the professions represent a relationship between an occupational group and the community, and one which is particular because the professional is able to, one way or another, take advantage of the community simply because of their professional expertise. And so the important thing about professions is the necessity for trust. And as we've outlined, trust is something which is necessary in a professional relationship far more than with other occupations. That's, I think, probably the most important thing. Ultimately, trust is not something that you can mandate by some sort of government regulation or the Australian Property Institute or the RICS or what have you making some statement, because one way or another, and you're going to find this in your professional practice, you can make more money by misbehaving, and it's very likely you'll get away with it for some time. The worst that might happen is that you might get thrown out of the API, you might lose your registration as a valuer if you're operating one of the states where registration is necessary. But you may have made an awful lot of money in the meantime, and so one way or another you might be quite happy to walk out the door and simply leave it behind. That's unfortunate though, because in a sense the community is expecting something of its professionals. It's expecting to be able to rely on them to be trustworthy. We have the issue of income, which we've seen is appropriate for professionals to have an higher income, not merely because of their power over the community, but rather as part of an interaction between them and the community, where the extra work, the extra education, the extra intellectual input is recognised and respected, and it's rewarded with that income which comes from the education, the risk-taking and things like that that are associated. So the income setting, while you can't set it using market forces, there is something else going on, which is really this ethical relationship between the community. The community has an obligation to care for its professionals and so provide for them at a higher standard of living perhaps than the average person who's cleaning the streets or something. But on the other hand, the professional has an obligation, and in neither direction can it be set by external forces, either by market forces or by the state. So it comes down to this question of ethics, and here we are almost going round in circles with ethics. In the extension presentation, we're going to explore in greater detail exactly what ethics are. For now, we're not going to sort of go into that because it's really quite a different topic. But one way or another, it has to do with this very important quality that goes right to the fundamentals of what makes society. And that is the free will decision to act in a way which benefits the other in a relationship. Professionals have a wonderful opportunity to live that principle of willing the good of the other. And in fact, we expect that. You can go into the local cafe and order a cup of coffee. You expect certain quality. And while you can certainly have recourse to legal help in the case of someone serving you soup that's got, I don't know, body parts in it or something, one way or another, there are a lot of places where people can treat you badly and you'll never know. But the ethical person, the ethical relationship, is where you don't have to worry about that, because for whatever reason, from somewhere within their standards that they live their own life by, they are freely choosing to choose your good rather than to use you for their benefit.